So, size actually does matter, like a lot. And bigger isn't necessarily always better. But what does this even mean? Well, let's define our terms, starting with wire gauge. For the purposes of this course, every time I talk about wire gauge, I am always referring to the American wire gauge, or AWG, which is also sometimes known as the Brown and Sharp Guide. All of the product links throughout the course also take you to items measured in American wire gauge. Gauge is the thickness of the wire the ring is made of. The smaller the size, the higher the number. It seems counterintuitive, but there we are. For example, from left to right, we have 12 gauge, 14 gauge, 16 gauge, 18 gauge, and 20 gauge. You will notice that the thicker the wire, the smaller the gauge number. The gauge of the ring is a completely separate measurement from the size of the ring. When it comes to ring size, I nearly always refer to it as the outer ring diameter in millimeters. One of the main reasons for this is that the main suppliers I use sell their jump rings by outer ring diameter in millimeters. The other reason is that jump rings are generally so small, usually a fraction of an inch, that millimeters are the best way to measure such small distances. That said, here are some examples of different commonly used ring sizes from left to right. 5 millimeter, 6 millimeter, 8 millimeter, 10 millimeter, and 12 millimeter. Now let's look at the gauge of each of these rings. Lining them up side by side, you can see that even though the ring sizes are dramatically different, they are all 18 gauge. Inner ring diameter will come into play very soon in the course, but for now, we'll just acknowledge it and set it aside. I've included a printable gauge, inches, millimeters chart in the lecture resources for your reference. Here are some important things to consider when purchasing jump rings, starting with shape. Most jump rings are round, but there are also oval, square, twisted round, and square wire round, just to name a few. I discussed jump ring material in detail in the lecture on metal choices, but I will just mention here again that it's one of the most important considerations when buying the right jump rings for your project. The cut of the rings is also very significant. Wherever possible, I always purchase saw-cut rings as opposed to machine-cut rings. Here's the difference. Machine-cut rings have very rough edges. They are certainly good for many applications, but for a piece of jewelry that will be in direct contact with the skin, they might not be the best choice. Saw-cut rings generally have smoother edges and are the ideal choice for jewelry or other fine work. If buying anodized rings, usually aluminum or niobium, check to see if the rings were first cut and then anodized, or anodized and then cut. This matters because if they were cut after the anodization process, the ring ends will not be colored and the resulting seam on the ring won't look as clean. So what sizes of jump rings should you buy for your project? That depends on a number of factors that all boil down to aspect ratio, which is covered in the next lecture. And this is just a reminder that you don't have to worry about what jump rings to buy for any project in this course because I've already done all the work for you. Links are provided to both individual items as well as project and course kits.
Go, go, go!